Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the College of Arts and Sciences Eye of the Hawk lecture. My name is Brad Runquist. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. We'd first like to thank our sponsors, Rick and Jody Burgum. We're grateful to the Burgums for their support of this lecture series and the many other ways they help UND students, faculty, and programs. Tonight we're excited to welcome Edward O'Keefe back to Grand Forks. After growing up here, graduating from Red River High School, and then later going on to Georgetown University where he studied English, psychology, and government. He went on to an award-winning journalism career at ABC News, CNN, and NowThis. As a Harvard Kennedy School Fellow, his research of the Theodore Roosevelt papers inspired his recently published book, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Focusing again on North Dakota, he now serves as CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. We are fortunate to welcome Mr. O'Keefe to UND, and equally happy that President Armacost has agreed to lead the discussion tonight. We're looking forward to learning more from Ed about the journey, the career, the book, and the library. Please welcome President Andy Armacost and Mr. Edward O'Keefe.
Hello. I tried it earlier and I said, scream if you can hear me. You didn't scream. That's okay. Well, it's good to see everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is an amazing opportunity for all of us to hear Ed O'Keefe talk. Thanks for being here, Ed.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome back to Grand Forks.
I love coming home.
And when was the last time?
Oh boy, we were here this summer. We brought our 13 and 8-year-old to Grand Forks and then out to Pelican Lake, and we try to get back for the holidays. My parents are in the crowd, both proud UND grads, Heather and Bill O'Keefe. My mother was a professor in the communications department for many years, so I'm the black sheep. I'm the only one that didn't attend UND, but I have, as I told Deanna, donated to the school, so that's what counts.
And there's a connection to your uncle as well.
We don't like to talk about my uncle.
Is he here?
No, that's why we're...
Then we can talk about him.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, my uncle Tim O'Keefe, known as the other O'Keefe in our family, he was the head of the foundation, I believe Deanna's predecessor.
So let's talk about Grand Forks. What was it like growing up here in the city of Grand Forks?
I think it was kind of magical growing up in Grand Forks. I mean, I loved growing up in Grand Forks because it had this combination of small town values with big town opportunities. I mean, the presence of the University of North Dakota, having 10,000+ students and professors. I mean, when I was growing up, my mom was a professor at the Department of Communications and Advertising and Marketing. We'd take these trips to New York with her classes to go to the Fashion Institute of Technology. We'd, their good friend was Professor Larry Lohendorf, who was an archaeologist, and they would take us out to Montana, and we'd go diving into ice caves, and we'd look for arrowheads in the hills of Montana. And so I felt like growing up in Grand Forks, I went back and I spoke at Red River High School earlier today, and it was just, nothing had changed and everything had changed, but it was the same place I remembered. It's just a wonderful community where you know that neighbor cares for neighbor, and yet you've got all these diverse interests of people and perspective and life that you can explore. So I felt it was the best of both worlds.
And you graduated from Red River in what year?
1996.
96, so just the year before the big flood.
Yes, and I was working, I was ending my freshman year, and I was interning at Senator Byron Dorgan's office when I would make calls back to my dad and say, they're talking with the Army Corps of Engineers and they're throwing around numbers like 50 feet. And, I said, well, nothing's not getting those numbers here. We're still in the house. And then had to look on in horror as, I began my freshman year at Georgetown University with a lot of people saying, where's North Dakota? Is that where Mount Rushmore is? And by the end of the year, I'm watching on the national news as my hometown floods and then goes through this horrendous fire. It reminded me of the Winston Churchill quote, "If you're going through hell, keep going." It was a terrifying moment, more for my family who was here, but it was surreal to be away at school and then watching the place you love destroyed.
Yeah, on national TV.
On national TV,
Yep.
Yes. And then I did a paper, actually. The relief for Grand Forks got caught in what I titled the paper "A Flood of Politics," because there was all of these different machinations happening. Remember, President Clinton came to Grand Forks. We had an all-Democratic delegation at that point, and then there was a huge harangue over getting the relief money that was necessary to do the rebuilding. And it was kind of I was in Washington, D.C., able to work on a thesis, a paper about something that was directly affecting my hometown, which was kind of fascinating for me.
Yeah, what a
Formative.
connection between your education and your work to your home.
Probably led me down the dark path of journalism. So.
Yeah, we'll take a journey down that path here in a minute, but you mentioned you were at your old high school today. Any old teachers still there? Did you see any familiar faces?
Mr. Douthit was leading me on this tour, so Chris Douthit, thank you.
Mr. Douthit, raise your hand.
Yeah.
Round of applause for Mr. Douthit.
But I remember, he has passed away sadly now, but Gene Martin was a very formative teacher at Schrader Middle School. He was a big guy, really formidable, and I remember there was this one test. Everybody had studied for 8th grade American history, U.S. history, and at the time of the test, he handed out this single piece of paper with a kind of frontier cottage on it and said, "This is the test." And everybody's freaking out. Like, what are you talking about? We've studied everything we were supposed to study to know these facts about U.S. history. And he said, "I want you to take every fact that you've learned and tell me a story about that time in U.S. history based on what you see in this picture." And I just couldn't stop writing. I was writing. I thought that was... So he really tapped in me this passion for history, but also this need to tell stories. That the past really teaches us about the present, which can make us understand and how to build a better future.
Do you remember what you wrote about?
Well, I mean, I don't remember. I know I wrote a lot because my classmates were really upset with me.
You kept going.
I kept going and going and
yeah.
going, and they were ready to protest that this was the most outrageous thing that Mr. Martin had ever done. And I, again, sadly, Mr. Martin passed, but I sent a copy of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt to his widow recently, and wrote a note inside that this book would not be possible without your husband. So, it meant a lot.
Wow. So that type of impact is huge, right? And undoubtedly, it influenced, in some way, your journey into your career. So any direct impact that you can talk about the influence that your high school or middle school teachers had on driving you to the profession that you chose?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can go back to elementary school. I mean, at Kelly Elementary School, Gloria Sanford was my 3rd grade teacher. She is the spouse of Mark Sanford, who was so influential in the Grand Forks public school system, and served in the state legislature for many years. And I was having trouble learning how to read and write. I mean, I just, it wasn't clicking for me. And Mrs. Sanford said, "Well, what do you love?" And I said, "Well, I love television. I love watching TV," whatever teacher really wants to hear. And she said, "Okay, well, do you have favorite actors? Do you have people?" And I said, "Yeah, I do, actually." And so she said, "Why don't you write them a letter? Why don't you write them a letter telling them how much you like what they do, and maybe they'll write you back." And they did. I would write these letters, and then they would send me an autographed picture. They'd send me a note back, and that's how I learned how to read and write. I mean, that's what sparked the passion for me. Then I told you about the formative experience with Mr. Martin, but Mr. Kulak was an amazing teacher at Schrader Middle School who later went to Red River when they shifted the grades to 9 through 12. Mr. Sherwood and Mr. Opp, who ran the, Brad Sherwood and Dean Opp, who just got inducted into the Teacher Hall of Fame.
Oh, Dean
at
did?
Red River. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, surprised. I was surprised too. No, they ran the summer performing arts program, which I did every summer. We walked through the theater today, and all the memories come flooding back. We built the sets, we rehearsed, it was like a little club that we had in the theater program. And by the way, when Mr. Opp and Mr. Sherwood would come to New York every other year with the class from Red River, wherever I was, ABC News, NowThis, CNN, I would always bring the class in between their trips to Broadway, and we'd go see whatever live production was happening. So one of the best times we got to see Anderson Cooper was taping AC 360, and the whole class got to come in and see it. So it's been nice to be able to make those connections between my professional life and growing up.
And your favorite role that you played in SPA or high school theater?
Oh, well, that's got a UND connection.
Oh.
So I played Polonius in Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true. And there was a professor at the University of North Dakota in the English department who could do a college interview. And I had just played Polonius in Hamlet, and so I knew all the lines, and so I did my interview with a professor in the English department, and pretty sure that's how I got into college. Pretty sure that was.
Your iambic pentameter carried the day.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I was able to quote Shakespeare in the college interview, and that was one of the only ones I was able to do in Grand Forks. I mean, every other one, you either couldn't do the interview because they were somewhere else, or I would have to travel to Fargo or further if that was possible to do the interview. But that one was here at UND with a professor in the English department.
Nice. So one more question about high school. So the mascot or the logo of your high school are the Rough Riders, right? The Red River Rough Riders. And that was the name, of course, of Teddy Roosevelt's division or group when he was on horseback and in the Army. Was there a connection there? Is that what ignited your initial interest in TR?
I think indoctrination might be more accurate. I think it was traveling back today and walking through Red River, it's sort of, now I see. I mean, you live life moving forward, but it only makes sense looking backward. I think pieces fell into place for me today where I was like, well, how did I not end up writing a book about Theodore Roosevelt and running the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library? Because, here I grew up in this place that, believe you can and you're halfway there, is emblazoned upon the walls. And, my family, we loved to travel out to Medora. We'd see the Medora musical. We'd go to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It was just ingrained. I think, growing up in North Dakota, you hear that story of Theodore Roosevelt. You want to understand the connection to this particular place. You hear the phrase, I never would have been president but for my experiences in North Dakota, and it resonated with me. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
So let me now turn to your career. The early days, in fact, the first day at ABC News. We talked earlier about the connection between you being away from your home and seeing tragedy unfold here. But your first day at ABC News, you were there for another major tragedy in the history of the U.S. Can you share that day?
Sure. My first day on Capitol Hill was 9/11. And I had been told that this was going to be a temporary assignment. I got the call on September 10th to report to the Capitol. I had no congressional ID. I had no idea where to park. I didn't know any of the logistics. And I remember I got there at about 6:30 in the morning. I found where to go. And the first thing I was assigned to was a press conference on rural cell phone coverage. And I'm like, well, near and dear to my heart. I've been in parts of North Dakota where my cell phone didn't work. And And the camera operator came up to me with his beeper, and it said plane crash in New York. And I said, okay, well, but we've got to keep covering this. And then he came up with a second message that said plane crashes into World Trade Center. And I said, okay, let's pick up stakes and let's go. I got back into the Capitol, and by the time I got into the Capitol, the Capitol Police came running through the hallways screaming, get out, run. And so I ran with my crew, and we got to an outside position where we could try and get into live lines, and we were just about to get the live camera up when, again, the police screamed, you need to move further back, run, there's a plane coming for the Capitol. And I had not seen any images. All I had known is that a plane had crashed in New York. And I ran through the Capitol grounds. I met the correspondent with whom I was going to be working for the next 5 years. She literally ran out of her shoes, and I picked up her shoes, and I said, Linda Douglas, I'm Ed O'Keefe, and here are your shoes. And we jumped behind a wall that used to exist. The Capitol Visitor Center is there now, but there was a wall between the Supreme Court and the Capitol, and we crouched down there. And I remember, this would be hard, but I remember Linda called her daughter and said goodbye. And I thought, oh God, could this really be it? It was crazy. So, but it didn't. The plane that was meant for the Capitol crashed in Pennsylvania, didn't make its way to the Capitol. So we got back up, and I spotted the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I ran up to him and I said, Senator, we have a live camera. We didn't. We have a live location. We didn't. If you could just come with me, we're going to be able to get you on air so we can talk about what's happened. And that senator followed us to the live location at Fox, and we convinced them to let us go up on their roof. We went up to the roof. All together, he's walking up the catwalk with us. We got on the roof, and we all got our first view of the Pentagon, smoldering in the distance in the smoke and the alarms going off everywhere. And we got that senator on television to do a live interview with Peter Jennings and with my correspondent, Linda Douglas, and his name was Joe Biden.
No kidding.
And he was the first public official to come on air and to tell the nation, because remember, the president was being relocated to multiple Air Force bases for safety reasons. And so, as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden said it's almost certainly a terrorist attack, it's likely Al-Qaeda, and called for Congress to come back into session that night, which they later did, and all gathered on the steps of the Capitol and sang God Bless America together. So my day started with a run for my life, and it ended watching all members of Congress gathered back together to sing God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol.
I have to ask a question of the crowd. How many were actually born after September 11th of 2001? Raise your hands, yeah. So the farther and farther we go away from that date, the more likely it is that fewer people actually experienced it or remember it. And these kinds of stories are certainly harrowing and bring back those memories. And we need to pay attention and continue to remember that history. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Now, moving away from that day, I know that you had worked for ABC for more than a decade. And then there was one, we all probably remember Peter Jennings. Raise your hand if you remember Peter Jennings, of course. And you had a particular way to influence the stories that he chose to cover.
I would trick him.
You would trick him. How would you do? Let everybody know your methods.
So Peter was a formidable figure in broadcast television history, and he had a very, very set routine. Every day by about 3:30 in the afternoon, he would take a break from his writing, and he would check abcnews.com. And the only thing he would ever look at was the most emailed stories on the list. So being industrious, perhaps a little devious, every day I would start my day doing my regular job, which was as a production assistant, which meant I made copies and ran around and doing whatever Peter Jennings wanted us to do. And I would self-assign a story that I could report and write. And I would write that story, and then I would email it to every single person I'd ever met in my entire life. I'd email it to my mom, my dad, my brother, my sisters, my cousins, my friends, my enemies, anybody, until eventually by 3:30 in the afternoon, that story was the #1 most emailed story on abcnews.com. And Peter, 3 times out of 5, would say, "What is this story about, fundraising in North Dakota? I mean, why? What is this?" And everybody go, what is this story? And inevitably they'd say, okay, he wants a piece. I mean, Peter wants a piece for the evening news. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. You only had 3 hours until World News aired at 6:30. They had to let me produce it. So I would get my way out of production associate duty by writing a story for abcnews.com, getting Peter Jennings to see it atop the list, and then I had 3 hours to produce the piece. And it almost always made air. So
Talk about deadlines. Holy smokes.
I work, deadlines work.
They do.
Deadlines work.
Wow. So an early influencer, I suppose. Was this in the day? This was pre-social media, or
This was pre-social media.
Right, so,
I think it was a very easy-to-game system. You just emailed everybody you knew, and it would eventually get to the top of the list. That would probably not work today. Yeah, pre-social media.
So there's another famous person. You came into contact with many famous people, I'm sure, but another one that many of us know is Anthony Bourdain, right, who passed away several years ago.
Yes, right? In 2018.
2018. But you helped launch a website called explorepartsunknown.com, which was the digital component to the Emmy and Peabody winning show called Parts Unknown, which starred Bourdain. So what was it like working with him?
I mean, I was on the I'm the outer edge of the inner circle. I didn't have enough tattoos to really appeal to Tony Bourdain. He preferred broken toys. And he was just such an incredible, authentic voice. I mean, he knew what stories he wanted to tell, and he had a masterful way of telling them. He was a beautiful, beautiful writer, but he was also extraordinarily obstinate. And so my job was to go to him. I had a special skill of being able to, well, basically I was somewhat fearless. I didn't care if he said no. So they always gave me the assignments that they knew were going to be absolutely impossible. So one time I had a salesperson come to me and say, well, look, good news, we've got a brand really interested. They want to give us multiple millions of dollars to work with Tony. I said, okay, who is it? And they said, it's Panda Express. And I said, I don't know that Tony Bourdain is going to want to work with, no offense to Panda Express, I just don't think that's going to happen. They're like, yeah, well, look, I have to be able to tell my client that I took the idea to Tony. I said, okay, all right, I'll do it. And so I took it to Tony, and I said, all right, Tony, here it is. It's a lot of money. It's Panda Express. And he totally deadpans. He says, I'll do it. I said, really? You'll do it? He said, yeah, I'll do it on one condition. They have to agree to serve live panda. I said, thank you very much. I really appreciate the episode. Yes. So he was irascible, but brilliant.
So there was a connection between Tony Bourdain and Grand Forks that many people here probably know about, many don't. And I don't know, you know the story of Marilyn Haggerty.
Of course.
Can you share it? And were you the source? Were you the connection between the two of them?
No, believe it or not, no. Okay. I was not. I mean, so Marilyn Haggerty, the famed columnist for the Grand Forks Herald, wrote a review of the Olive Garden. And it was a very earnest, lovely review of the breadsticks and the pasta and how pleasant the waiters are and that they'll refill your water whenever you'd like. And it went viral. And she was getting mercilessly mocked in some corners. And Anthony Bourdain, the chef of all chefs, came to her defense and said, this is America. We can't make fun of the Olive Garden, and actually published a book with Marilyn. And so, yeah, we talked about my Grand Forks connection and Marilyn Haggerty, but that was purely Tony. That's a good example of the kind of dichotomy that was him.
Yeah, he jumped right in.
Yeah, I mean, he could go to West Virginia and shoot guns, and he could go to the most liberal enclave of New York, and they all loved him. I mean, because he was interested in people. He was curious. He had no prejudgment about who people were or why they were the way they were. He would just go and ask questions and learn.
So let's turn our attention now to the subject of your book and Teddy Roosevelt. And what drew your attention to TR in the way that it did that got you writing about him?
Well, after Tony died, the show obviously ended, and I left CNN, and I found myself at Harvard University as an entrepreneurship fellow. And my job ostensibly there was to look into the future of news and media. I was looking into Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Apple, and whether they would, in 2019, they said, we'll never do three things. We'll never do news, we'll never do live, and we'll never do sports. Well, it's 2024, folks. They're doing live, they're doing news, and they're doing sports. So that's what I thought my future was going to be. I was going to, take what I had learned working with Bourdain and others. I found that was a nonfiction news program that everybody could relate to. Right? It wasn't divisive. It was very unifying and intriguing and curious, and I wanted to do that more. And so that's what I was at Harvard to do. And secretly, I was sneaking off to the Houghton Library, where a big part of the Theodore Roosevelt collection is held, and doing research. And I thought, I've always wanted to write a book about Theodore Roosevelt. I've finally left after 20 years in media. I'll have the opportunity to write a book proposal. And as I thought I would be writing about Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands, about his formative experiences in North Dakota and how nature was his classroom and essentially saved his life. But as I was researching, I kept bumping into these extraordinary women, his mother, his two sisters, and his two wives. And they were giving him advice and influencing his political opinions. They were involved in every aspect of every decision he ever made. And I thought, well, these have always been secondary characters to the story I know. This is not the story I was told growing up in North Dakota and going to Medora. That's the story that I want to tell. So I put the book proposal together for The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and Simon & Schuster bought it. And just a mere 5 years later, it was published in May.
Oh,
yes.
Congratulations. What a big
Thank you.
step, and just a tremendous honor to have that work published. So there's a quote, "The light has gone out of my life." And that's what TR wrote in his diary on Thursday, February 14th, 1884, which is the day that both his wife and his mother died, same day. And was this what drew you, or what set of experiences pulled you in to write about? I mean, you mentioned that the centerpiece kept going back to these strong women in his life. So what drew you into that story?
Well, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that perhaps the most masculine president in the American memory was actually the product of unsung and extraordinary women. His mother, Mittie, was this vivacious Southerner. She was actually the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Margaret Mitchell talked about that in the 1920s. She was vivacious and had these coy turns of phrase. She's the one who introduced Theodore to these books called the McGuffey Readers, where they had these African proverbs, speak softly and carry a big stick. And she also, after the death of her husband, Theodore's father, taught him this remarkable phrase, live for the living and not for the dead. She said, you would dishonor the memory of your father if you didn't live a life of purpose. And so Mitty, she's been completely maligned by history, I mean, really kind of written off as a Victorian who had no formative influence in his success at all. And so she was an intriguing character. And then you had Bammy, his older sister. And Bammy is a political strategist. I mean, his daughter, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, says of Bammy that had she been a man, she, not Theodore Roosevelt, would have been president of the United States. So it's a remarkable statement. His younger sister, Connie, they take advantage of the misogyny of the era in New York, and she'll sit in on meetings privately, sewing in the back of the room, hearing everything that's said, and then strategize with him, such that Theodore Roosevelt said at the end of his governorship in New York, haven't we had fun being governor of New York? So one sister could have been president were she a man. The other sister is essentially his co-governor. His mother, who's been maligned by history, is actually really integral in forming his empathy and his ability to, his resilience through physical and sometimes emotional pain. And then you've got his two wives. Alice is his first wife, but arguably his second love, and Edith is his second wife, but undoubtedly his first love. He meets Edith when she's 3 years old. They know each other for 57 years of Theodore's life, and they're together basically all the time throughout their childhood. Everyone expects them to get married, but on August 22nd, 1878, they have a rupturous split, and they break up, seemingly forever. And shortly thereafter, Theodore meets Alice and falls head over heels in love. It's Edith who at that point. And Alice, in his time with Alice, his 1880 senior thesis, Theodore Roosevelt's 1880 senior thesis, endorses suffrage 40 years before the 19th Amendment. He calls for women to be doctors, lawyers, and judges. He says that women should own property and that they should not necessarily take their husband's name upon marriage. Incredibly progressive document for 1880. That's all due to Alice. And in their short time together, he, in his own words, rose like a rocket. He was elected to the New York State Assembly, the youngest state assemblyman ever elected. He writes his first major book, The Naval War of 1812. He attends but doesn't complete law school, the only thing Theodore Roosevelt ever quit. So if anybody ever quits law school, you've got something in common with Theodore Roosevelt. So it's just fascinating. And then February 14th, 1884, this devastating event. He loses his wife and his mother on the same day in the same house. He writes an X in his diary, the light has gone out of my life. He doesn't stand for re-election, and he comes to the Dakota Badlands, lives as a rancher and a cowboy for the better part of 2 years until he meets again Edith. So it is the loss of love that brings him to the Badlands of North Dakota. It's the rediscovery of a childhood love that brings him back out. That's the story that had to be told.
And where did he re-find Edith?
Well, there's a little mystery around that. He said to his sisters, under no circumstances when I come back from the Badlands do I want to see Edith. And he knew he would fall back in love with her, and indeed that's what happened. Edith was having tea at Bammy's house, somehow got delayed, and Theodore came in the front door, and they met again, the sparks flew, and within 6 weeks they were secretly engaged. Didn't tell anybody in the family. The New York Times somehow found out and reported it. Theodore's back in the Badlands, and Bammy, his older sister, demands a retraction and gets it from the New York Times because they had reported that he was engaged to Edith Carew. She sends a letter to Theodore saying, that damned New York Times, always making things up about you. I've got this retraction. He sends an extraordinary letter back from the Badlands that says, that damned New York Times, always making things up about me. But this one happens to be true. I am engaged to Edith. We are to be wed by the end of the year. And he confesses everything to his sister.
And after that marriage, how often would he make it back out to Western North Dakota?
Frequently. I mean, when he said, "I never would have been president without my experiences in North Dakota," it was not a political statement. There was an event in 1910 after he was president in Fargo. There were 30,000 people in the streets of Fargo. They had arranged a special train from Grand Forks to bring 500 people down to Fargo to be present for Theodore's visit. And they cheered for him in the streets as he entered. They had a 30-person motorcade to protect him as he went through to the hotel. And as he arrived at the hotel, there were school children who were present, and the teachers had trained them to say, "Hurrah for Teddy! Hurrah for Teddy!" And he came over and said to the school children, "Well, now this is much more enjoyable than being with your governor or your senators." And took the teddy bears and was induced to come to the balcony to speak. And it's in that speech that he first made the statement, "I never would have been president except for my experiences in North Dakota." And then you'll appreciate it was the next day that he repeated the statement. He was on stage at Fargo College, which no longer exists, and he was next to the president of UND when he made the statement again. So it's pretty, I mean, he came back 20, 25 times over his lifetime. He owned the Elkhorn Ranch for way up into 1890s. I mean, the connection is very, very real between TR and North Dakota.
It's interesting you mentioned Fargo College. Most people don't know, but the largest victory of UND in its history was an 84-0 victory over Fargo College. And the reason I bring that up, of course, how do I know this? I'm asking Kathy, my wife, is that TR actually had an important role with respect to college football. In fact, there's a book out called Teddy Roosevelt and the Big Scrum. It's written by an author named Williams, John Williams. Tell us a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt and college football and his legacy, because I think it's an important one.
Theodore Roosevelt saved football. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt, he's the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first president to pass 234 million acres of conserved land, a record that has not been equal to this day. He passes the first protections for food and drug. Extraordinary legacy. But one of the lesser known parts of his legacy is the game of football was so incredibly violent that kids were getting not only hurt, but in some instances killed. And the college presidents of several of the northeastern schools gathered together and said, "We're going to ban football." So he said, "Well, the hell you are," and called the college presidents to the White House for a conference and basically said, "Now, instead of banning football, what can we do to make the game safer?" And that led to the creation of the NCAA. So the highest award that you can receive in the NCAA to this day is the Theodore Roosevelt Award, because of his formative experience in not just saving football, but creating the Student Athlete Association that represents all sports at the college level to this day.
And I won't comment too much, but perhaps we need Teddy Roosevelt back these days. Was that a commentary? I guess
No.
it was. Yeah.
No, please.
So let's, I'll have two more questions and then we'll open it up to the crowd for theirs. And the first one, tell us a little bit about Medora. You mentioned it earlier in the talk, and what's the significance of Medora? How many people have been to Medora? Yeah.
All right.
So about 2/3 haven't. So a little bit about Medora, because that was where Teddy's home was. And what's the significance from that point to today?
Well, so Medora is the future home of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. That is where Theodore Roosevelt came and lived for the better part of those 2 years as a rancher and a cowboy when he was depressed and dejected after the loss of his wife and mother on the same day in the same house. He lived amongst the 65 million years of geologic history that unfold in the Badlands like a textbook. He really used nature as his classroom and his teacher his whole life. And that formative experience in the Badlands, where he was working the other end of the saw. He had to do his part in the roundup. He had to really prove that he could live what he later called the strenuous life. I have never been to Theodore Roosevelt National Park without running into somebody who's going through a divorce or has lost somebody significant in their life. And it's a magical kind of place that just has a healing power. And it's interesting that, to me, right after Theodore Roosevelt's death in 1919, Congress, for the first and only time, passed a memorial association to a president and commanded that they look at 2 different locations to memorialize Theodore Roosevelt. 1, Oyster Bay, his home in New York, where they did create a memorial park, and 2, they said there has to be a memorialization in North Dakota. And that became Theodore Roosevelt National Park. So from the very beginning, right after TR's death, there was a recognition that this person was a northern father, a southern mother, an eastern birth, and a western political identity. When you're in the East, when you're at Sagamore Hill, when you're at his home, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's ghost. When you're in the West, when you're in the Badlands, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's spirit. And we really believe that the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum is going to be a place where you can get in to get out, to go on a hike, to go on a bike ride, to ride horseback to the Presidential Library. We've got a Snøhetta design building that gracefully disappears into the landscape. You can go up on the roof, 38 feet tall, get a 360-degree view of the Badlands, both north and south, perfectly framed view of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, 32,000 square feet of exhibit experience, which is going to move both chronologically and in experience through the life of TR. It's really going to be, we like to say this will be the Presidential Library where kids drag their parents, where families can get out in nature together, and a real tribute to his essence in this state and the importance of it in the nation's history.
And tell us a little bit about your journey to the role that you're in to lead the TR Presidential Library.
That guy right there. Robbie Loff, who is in the crowd, is our executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. I mentioned before that I went to Harvard. He was on a Truman Scholarship at Harvard. He went to some other school. I can never remember the name of it. It's like SUDS or ND something. Anyway, it's somewhere else. It's okay. And he was at Harvard on a Truman Scholarship. We met there. And it's 2 North Dakotans. You're inevitably going to meet wherever you are in the world. And he said, well, wait a second. So you're from North Dakota. You're writing a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and you're thinking about what to do next in your career. Have you heard about this little project going on in our home state? And I thought, hey, maybe I'll be a trustee. Maybe this will be good for the book. I'll be a part of this organization. I mean, I was already writing the book. I thought I would go work in the future of news and nonfiction and streaming, and just felt called to do this. I mean, it was almost providential. The North Dakota State Legislature had passed a $50 million endowment contingent on our ability to raise $100 million by the end of 2020. And so that's sort of where it started, was, my whole career had been coming into circumstances where you didn't really know how to figure out this problem. You had to talk to a source or put a story together from 3:30 to 6:30, or, run from the Capitol and then get back on your feet and convince the Senate Foreign Relations Chair to do an interview. I guess a great big giant opportunity attracted me. And I thought, well, we need an architect, we need land, and we need money. So that's what we set about doing. We said we held a design competition and selected Snøhetta, the designers of the 9/11 Museum and Memorial in New York. We did raise the $100 million to unlock the $50 million endowment, and we've kept on going since then. And we acquired the land through a congressional act that passed in late 2020. So, somehow it called upon all the things and skills I had done, plus I was able to do it while being back home.
That's incredible. And then what's the outlook? When can we expect the library and museum to be open to the public and accepting those kids to bring their parents back?
Yes, so we have now raised $321 million, a little more than we expected at the beginning. And some great Grand Forks natives joined me on the journey along the way. Ken Vian is in the crowd tonight. For those who know Ken Vian, one of our councilmen here in Grand Forks, let's give him a round of applause. Ken Ken came on board in November of 2019. I took the job in October of 2019. We had no money, no architect, no land, and here's this kid from, born in Grand Forks, now living in New York. He took a huge leap of faith to come on board the project and really got us guided to where we needed to go. Dan Muse is our Chief Development Officer. He's in the crowd tonight. Formerly with the UND Foundation, did a pretty amazing job there. Helped us raise all of this money that we need to do the construction. We're halfway through the construction, and we are anticipating our open on July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of America. So if you go out to Medora today, you can see it. There is an enclosed facility that they are working on. We walked up on the roof about 2 weeks ago, got that view from 38 feet up. It's going to be absolutely spectacular. And we're working with a lot of different, one of our aspirations is to host a presidential debate at the auditorium in the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, but we need an academic partner. Do you happen to know any?
We're in.
All right.
We're in.
All right.
In fact, Bill Sorensen, former mayor of Bismarck, who is active in the library and in the Medora community, has suggested a leadership forum. I think Admiral Bill Owens is
Yes.
coming aboard to offer something. So UND's in discussions with them as well to see if there's ways to connect the leadership programs here with what's happening out there.
Well, we've talked about AI. We are in conversations on how we might be able to recreate Theodore Roosevelt using AI, and the visitors could have an actual conversation with the president. That's something that obviously UND is very invested in. The aerospace program, the drone technology. I really do think that across the state, there are immense opportunities to work together. When you have a presidential library and museum in the name of one of the most popular figures in American history, who I like to say is a bit like a Rorschach test. What you see in Theodore Roosevelt says more about you than it does about him. Republicans, Democrats, independents, everyone loves him. And we need to take advantage of that in North Dakota. Do things here that bring people together, have conversations, do convenings, education, speaker series. So much we could do with the park. It's really limitless.
Nice. Well, you've heard enough from me. I think you'll get far more interesting questions from the members of the room. So let's turn it over to the crowd. There's a microphone or two floating around. Rob Carolyn in the back has a mic. Raise your hand if you have a question for Ed O'Keefe. In the front left here, my front left. Your front right.
This is daring, since there are members of my team in the crowd. Get me on the spot.
Thank you so much for being here this evening and for being on campus. I just have to ask about primary source documents.
Sure.
About the book.
Yes.
My background is in women and gender studies, and one of the vexing aspects of doing that work, of bringing women to voice from the archives and making women's subject, not object, is that they're so often dropped from the official archive of history. And unless maybe they're connected to a famous man, but they don't show up in military records, church records, the traditional historical archives that we have. So what did you find? I'm fascinated and can't wait to hear. I'm guessing letters, diaries, but I'll let you answer.
Well, so there are 11 new letters in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that have never been published before. They were locked in a safe in Sagamore Hill since 1954, and Harvard actually called those 11 letters one of the greatest discoveries since Theodore Roosevelt's death in 1919. Those were pretty extraordinary letters between some of the members of his family and the women in his life. There were 24 love letters that had never before been published in a major book. They were not available to David McCullough when he wrote Mornings on Horseback, nor were they available to Edmund Morris when he wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. Those 24 letters are the letters that really show that complex relationship between Alice and Theodore. Again, they were in the possession of a family member who simply held on to them. Maybe one of the most disappointing parts of the project is that Edith burned most of the correspondence between she and Theodore. She did not want, and neither did her sister, did his sisters necessarily, anybody to really know how profound their influence was on him. I think one of the, I had this fascinating conversation with Dr. Kathleen Dalton, who for my money wrote the best single-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt, A Strenuous Life. And Kathy, I was talking with her about exactly the subject that you're asking about. Why are we not able to look at Theodore Roosevelt as anything but the product of his own will? And she said, time. We, unlike the United Kingdom, don't have stories in our history about Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth and these powerful figures that make it totally acceptable to see women in power. You need to tell these stories because the women were always there. They just haven't been the focus of the story. And I think what was so fun for me in this project is the story I was told growing up in North Dakota is that Theodore Roosevelt was a self-made man, and I think that's true in part, but it's not the whole story. He had his wife, he had his sisters, he had his mother. He had these people in his life that picked him up and pushed him forward when he needed help. And we are, all of us, if we're fortunate, have a mother, brother, sister, colleague, friend, somebody who, when we're down and out, pushes us forward. And I think it actually makes Theodore Roosevelt more universally relatable, not less so, to know that the people in his life did that for him. But it is a vexing problem with, they often destroy those documents or they intentionally don't want to be a part of the story. So you got to dig. You got to dig and you got to see, every single time you see a situation, you have to ask yourself, what was she doing? What was she thinking? What was her perspective? Not what was he doing? What was he thinking? What was he doing? And that changes the story.
Great, thanks, Randy. Next question. Raise your hand if you have the next question. And if it's a student, I'm sure your professor will give you extra credit.
So, when this happened this morning, I was at Red River, and there was just a little bit of time left in the period, and I said, if you don't ask any further questions, you have to go to your next class. Boom! We got a lot of questions.
It was incentives.
What's your favorite color? And,
It can be about the book, the wonderful book. It can be about Ed's career as well, at ABC and CNN. I see a smile in the back. Okay, the student in the very back. Go ahead, sir.
Hang on.
Dickinson State College was in the running for this library. Were they ever really in the running, or was that just a rumor?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. So we're actually working with the Theodore Roosevelt Center. Part of the agreement for the $50 million endowment was to make a $10 million donation to the Theodore Roosevelt Center, which we did in 2021. So we're actually very, very critical partners of the Theodore Roosevelt Center. We acquired the archive of Edmund and Sylvia Morris. Sylvia wrote the single-volume biography of Edith in the late 1970s, and then, of course, Edmund wrote the trilogy about TR. That archive, we were in competition with the University of Texas, with Harvard, with Yale. It's at Dickinson State University. And so we are helping to digitize documents from Theodore Roosevelt's life. We're actually working with them to have physical archives and curated archives at DSU. So very critical partners, absolutely. We got one right there. Oh, well, hello.
Hey, Kathy.
Kathy. Hi. I didn't see you back there.
So I'm going to take advantage of a friendship and give Ed a chance to rave about his own wife, since you know the influence of other wives on famous people. Say a word about the role she's played in your writing.
I would love to. Thank you, Kathy Gershman, another proud UND alum and teacher. My wife, Allison Davis O'Keefe, was a journalist at CBS News when we met when I was working for ABC News. The alphabet brought us together. And she has been an incredible resource in the writing of this book and an immense supporter in the total patience it takes to watch me pivot from media to the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Project. She worked on this project for almost 3 years. When I started the project, I mentioned I started in October of 2019. Very shortly thereafter, we had a worldwide global pandemic, and she was disinfecting RFQs. She was putting on a mask and flying to North Dakota in May of 2020 for the design competition. She worked on the design and construction team with Ken Vian. And I think it's safe to say not only would this book not be possible, which is dedicated to her, by the way, but the library would not be happening without Allison Davis O'Keefe. So thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Great work, Allison. Good. We have time for one more question.
You got one in the back.
Ed, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt's relationship with the indigenous peoples of North Dakota and also the library's future relationship with them.
Yes. Well, Theodore Roosevelt had a complicated relationship with the indigenous peoples of North Dakota. When he came to North Dakota, of course, you're just a few years after the surrender of Sitting Bull. You're not long after the complications of frontier movement across the West. What's interesting about Theodore Roosevelt is this kind of evolution on the issues of race and equality. The last speech that Theodore Roosevelt ever gave in his life was on November 2nd, 1918, to a mixed-race crowd at Carnegie Hall, where he made a full-throated endorsement of civil rights, such that people thought that had he been elected, he lived and been elected president in 1920, he might have put a knife in the heart of Jim Crow 45 years before the Civil Rights Act. He is by no means perfect. He is the one who had Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner, but then never did so again because of all the backlash that he received. He was vehemently anti-peonage and lynching. He took a private audience with Geronimo. Geronimo actually dedicated his book to him, his autobiography to him. It's a really complicated, interesting history because by the end of his life, he's speaking and doing things you wish he would have done when he had the power to change things. He's the first and only president, not the only, the first president to actually use the word Native American in an address to Congress. He traveled to the Pine Ridge Reservation in the 1890s as Civil Service Commissioner. In his home at Sagamore Hill, there's a depiction of the battle scene of the Battle of Little Bighorn of the Battle of Greasy Grass, which is kind of fascinating. So, we've really made a conscientious effort to reach out to the tribal nations that share geography with North Dakota. I spent a good portion of the summer of 2021 traveling to each of the nations and meeting with their chairs. The first thing we did after we acquired the land from the U.S. Forest Service was not a shovel ceremony, it was a land ceremony. We had a private meeting between the descendants of Theodore Roosevelt and the chairs of the indigenous nations in North Dakota. And then we traveled to the site of the land, and a spiritual leader from the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation blessed the land and buried tobacco with Theodore Roosevelt IV on a site that's going to be commemorated in the exhibit experience. So I think there's a lot we can do with the indigenous community. We're talking now about working together on a sky pavilion because the MHA Nation would navigate by water and by stars, and using that as an interpretive opportunity to talk about the relationship of Native Americans in that particular land. They do a lot of buffalo ceremonies with the national park that we've talked extensively about. So I think it's about both, one, making it known that Native Americans were not only here, but they are here, and they are strong, and they are vibrant, and they have these amazing communities that they want you to visit. And two, it's about humanizing, not lionizing TR. He said and did things we wouldn't necessarily wish that he did and said. We can say that, and we can be honest about that, and we can learn from it, because it's now important that we move forward together.
Great. Well, thanks for that great question and all the questions that we've heard tonight. Ed, we can't thank you enough for coming to UND and returning back to Grand Forks, your hometown, and sharing a bit of your life and your hard work in chronicling the loves of Teddy Roosevelt and joining us this evening. How about a round of
It
applause?
was my pleasure. Thank you.
And I believe after we break, we're going to have book signings and discussions for whoever wants to join Ed. I don't know where.
I think it's right outside.
Right out-
or right there,
right
right in
outside,
the back.
Tracy.
So I'm going to hop to the back.
Books for
Okay.
sale. The books will be for sale in the back, and then Ed
be
will
up
be up at the table up front here. So if you want to grab a book and then go up and see Ed, you're welcome to do that.
And we did have local artist Dave Badman, who's a local blacksmith,
yes.
do a special commemorative Eye of the Hawk ornament. So this is from artist Dave Badman in Grand Forks, representing the Eye of the Hawk.
Oh, this is fabulous. Thank you very
Great,
much.
thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Can I have my hat now? Can I have my hat? I need my hat. Here we go. Here, this will make my mom proud.
There we
Here.
go. Gotta
There
get a
we go.
photo.
There we go. There we go. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining
All
us
right,
this evening.
appreciate it.
It's been
Thank
great
you.
to meet you.
All right.
Folks, thank you all
Thanks
for
very
coming
much.
tonight. Have a wonderful evening.